In 1878, Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford wrote a letter in which he described what he expected from his coming campaign against the Zulu kingdom. "If I am called upon to conduct operations against the Zulus," he wrote, "I shall show them how hopelessly inferior they are to us in fighting power, although numerically stronger." On January 22, 1879, 11 months after writing those words, Chelmsford was riding across the hills of Zululand when he heard distant gunfire from the direction of his camp. He did not turn back immediately. He assumed it was a small skirmish, his rear guard dealing with some nuisance. He continued his reconnaissance. When he returned to camp at 5 in the afternoon, he found it silent. Not defended, not abandoned. Silent. The tents were still standing. The supply wagons were still there. The cooking fires, lit for lunch that would never be served, were still smoldering in the late afternoon light, and scattered across the ground in every direction as far as a man could see were the bodies of his soldiers. 52 British officers and more than 800 men of his regiment lay dead, killed in less than 3 hours, killed by men with spears. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 did not begin because Britain was threatened. It began because Britain decided, for reasons of colonial strategy, that the independent Zulu kingdom needed to cease to exist. The Zulu kingdom, under King Cetshwayo, occupied a substantial territory in what is now South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal province. Cetshwayo's army, the Impi, was a formidable military institution. Tens of thousands of warriors organized into age-grade regiments called Amabuto, assembled from boyhood and bound to their regiment for decades, trained in tactics that had been refined over 2 generations since Shaka had transformed Zulu warfare in the early 19th century. The assegai, the short stabbing spear, was the primary weapon, used after closing to hand distance. The large cowhide shield was not merely defensive, but a weapon in its own right, used to hook the enemy's shield aside and expose his body in the same motion. Warriors carried several throwing spears for the approach, and the stabbing spear for the kill. Some regiments also had muskets and old rifles, captured or purchased over the years, though their marksmanship was generally poor. Their real advantage was not weapons, but movement, coordination, and the willingness to absorb casualties in the open until they closed the distance that made firearms irrelevant. None of this particularly alarmed the British colonial administration, which had been operating in southern Africa for decades and had successfully subjugated or co-opted most of the region's African peoples. What alarmed them was simpler. The Zulu kingdom was large, independent, and neighbor to the British colony of Natal. Sir Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner for South Africa, had a vision of a unified British-dominated confederation in the region. The Zulu kingdom sat outside it, and its independence was an embarrassment and a strategic inconvenience. In December 1878, Frere issued Cetshwayo an ultimatum whose terms were deliberately constructed to be impossible to accept. The Zulus were to disband their entire military system within 30 days. They were to allow a British resident at the royal court. They were to permit missionaries into Zululand. These were demands that, if accepted, would have effectively ended Zulu sovereignty. Everyone involved knew Cetshwayo could not accept them without destroying his own legitimacy as king. He didn't accept them. On January 11, 1879, 3 British columns crossed into Zululand. Cetshwayo's strategy was cautious. He had forbidden his commanders to invade Natal, the British colony across the border, understanding that such an invasion would make it impossible to negotiate a peace and would bring overwhelming retaliation. He wanted to fight defensively, demonstrate that Britain could not conquer Zululand cheaply, and force a negotiated settlement. His orders to his commanders were specific: march slowly, attack at dawn, and destroy the Red soldiers. Lord Chelmsford understood none of this. He understood that the Zulus had a large army, that they would need to be defeated, and that they would probably try to avoid his columns and slip around them into Natal. His plan was to advance his 3 columns toward the Zulu capital at Ulundi, forcing the main Impi to stand and fight in a decisive engagement where British firepower would destroy it. What he did not adequately consider was what would happen if the Zulus found him first. On January 20th, Chelmsford's central column made camp at the base of a distinctive rocky outcrop called Isandlwana, a hill whose profile, when viewed from the south, resembles the small stomach of a cow, or in silhouette a crouching sphinx. Soldiers of the 24th Regiment who had been in Egypt noted uneasily that the sphinx shape matched the symbol on their regimental badge. It was the kind of observation that men make when they are in a strange place and slightly frightened and attribute meaning to coincidence. The camp covered a considerable area, 800 yards of tents, supply wagons, artillery, horses, oxen, and the 1,000 pieces of administrative apparatus required to move a Victorian military column through African terrain. It was never intended to be a permanent fortification. Chelmsford assumed it would be occupied for a day or two at most before the column moved on. This assumption had a significant practical consequence. He did not order it entrenched or lagered. Lagering, forming the supply wagons into a defensive circle, was standard British practice in southern Africa when facing indigenous adversaries. It created an instant fortification that a charging enemy, however numerous, would have to breach under sustained fire. Chelmsford's own written regulations for field forces in the region required that a defensible camp be established at every halt. At Isandlwana, he chose not to enforce his own rules. The camp was temporary. No attack was expected. On the morning of January 22nd, Chelmsford departed with a large portion of the column, roughly half his force, to scout toward what he believed was the location of the main Zulu army, 15 miles to the southeast. He left behind Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline with approximately 1,300 men, 6 companies of the 24th Regiment, artillery, colonial volunteers, and native auxiliaries. Pauline's orders were to defend the camp. At roughly 10:30 that same morning, Colonel Anthony Durnford arrived from Rorke's Drift with 500 mounted reinforcements. Durnford was senior to Pauline. There was an immediate unresolved dispute about who was actually in command of the camp. No clear order settled the question. Chelmsford had left without specifying precisely what Durnford, when he arrived, was supposed to do. What neither man knew was that 20,000 Zulu warriors were sitting in a valley 6 miles to the northeast, waiting. The main Zulu impi under Nashingwayo Kamahole had been marching for 5 days to reach its assembly point in the Nwebeni Valley, hidden behind a long ridge from which the British camp at Isandlwana was not visible. They had covered 80 kilometers since leaving the royal capital, a pace that dwarfed Chelmsford's column, which had managed 16 kilometers in 10 days. They were planning to attack on January 23rd, a day when the omens would be more favorable. They were not yet ready. Shortly after 11 in the morning, a patrol from Durnford's mounted troops crested the ridge above the Nwebeni Valley. They were not looking for the main impi. They were following a small group of Zulus that had been spotted on the plateau. They rode over the ridge and looked down. The valley below them was full of warriors, 20,000 men, sitting on their shields, the mass of them extending as far as the soldiers could see in either direction. For a moment, nothing happened. The patrol staring down, the warriors staring up. Then a Zulu leader gave an order. One account says the warriors simply rose spontaneously. Either way, the impi was moving. It was moving toward Isandlwana. The patrol wheeled their horses and galloped back toward camp. A runner reached Pauline minutes later with the report. A large Zulu force was advancing from the northeast. Pauline sent a message to Chelmsford, who was 15 miles away. Chelmsford received the message. He read it. He considered it for a moment, then decided it was probably exaggerated. His cavalry had been reporting large numbers of Zulus all morning, and none had materialized into a serious threat. He continued his reconnaissance. Back at camp, Pauline deployed his men. He extended the 24th Regiment in a firing line roughly half a mile in front of the camp. The line stretched perhaps a mile from end to end, thin enough that it was never less than a few yards between men. Durnford took his mounted troops further to the right, riding out to protect what he believed was Chelmsford's flank. The two forces were separated by a considerable gap. The impi came over the ridge in the classic Zulu formation, the horns of the buffalo, or Izimpondo Zenkomo. The chest moved directly toward the camp, drawing fire, absorbing punishment. The left horn swept wide to the north. The right horn swept wider still to the south, looping around to cut off any retreat. The movement was coordinated, practiced, disciplined. These were not wars charging in a mob. They were executing a maneuver they had trained for since adolescence, against an enemy whose firepower they had been briefed on and whose positions they had been watching since before dawn. For a time, the Martini Henry held them. The rifle was the best infantry weapon in the world in 1879. It fired a heavy .45 caliber bullet with tremendous stopping power, capable of killing a man at 500 yards, and accurate well beyond that in the hands of a trained soldier. A British infantryman could fire 12 aimed rounds per minute. 6 companies of the 24th, lined up in extended order, could put an extraordinary volume of fire into an attacking force at ranges where assegai armed warriors were entirely powerless. The chest of the impi took enormous casualties. The warriors in the front ranks ran forward, were cut down, and the warriors behind them kept running forward over the bodies. They were trained not to stop, not to turn back, not to take cover except to use the natural terrain, the dongas, the dry stream beds, the rocky outcroppings, as shields as they advanced. They had been told by their commanders and believed that if they could close to hand distance, the rifles could not save the British. They were right. On the British right, Durnford's mounted troops had ridden out to protect the flank and were now heavily engaged with the left horn of the impi. They fought a fighting retreat, dismounting at defensible ground, firing volleys, remounting, falling back, dismounting, again. They held longer than anyone had a right to expect. But Durnford's men had come from Rorke's Drift with their ammunition on wagons that were somewhere on the track behind them. As the engagement wore on, they ran short of cartridges. Durnford's men began desperately sending riders back to find ammunition. Here, the story of Isandlwana acquires a detail that has been argued about ever since. The British ammunition was stored in heavy wooden boxes at the rear of the camp. The boxes were secured with a single metal screw. Some accounts, including one from a young lieutenant named Horace Smith Dorrien, who survived and later became a general in the First World War, described a quartermaster refusing to issue ammunition to soldiers who were not from his own regiment. The standing orders were clear. Reserves were earmarked for Lord Chelmsford's force, and issuing them to others required authorization. In the middle of a battle, with the camp beginning to dissolve around him, Quartermaster Edward Bloomfield of the 2nd Battalion was still following his orders. Screws were found bent and broken all around the British firing line afterward, evidence that men had been opening boxes in haste, smashing the fastenings with rifle butts and boots. The ammunition was there. Getting it to the men who needed it across a line that now extended over a mile in time to matter was a different question. Shortly after noon, the native contingent, African auxiliaries fighting alongside the British, broke and ran. They had been fighting in the line between the main 24th positions and Durnford's mounted troops on the right. When they fled, they left a gap several hundred yards wide in the middle of the British line. The gap was large enough for Zulu warriors to pour through. The impi did not stop to exploit it. It continued its encircling movement. The right horn swept south and east, completing the loop around the camp. The left horn swept north. The chest pressed directly in. The shape of the maneuver was designed specifically for this moment, not to break through a line, but to envelop it, to leave no direction for retreat except through warriors already behind you. Pauline tried to consolidate his position. He pulled the firing line back toward the camp. The retreat compressed the British into a smaller and smaller perimeter. The firing became desperate. Men were taking cartridges from the pouches of soldiers already dead. The artillery, 2 7-pounder guns, fired until the crews were overwhelmed. At approximately 2:29 in the afternoon, a partial solar eclipse darkened the sky. The midday sun dimmed to something like twilight. Some accounts from survivors describe the light changing noticeably, turning the battle into a scene of figures moving in strange, grayed half-darkness. The Zulus, by several accounts, found this alarming. The sun going black during the fighting was not an omen anyone had prepared for. It did not stop them. Within 30 minutes of the eclipse, the camp was lost. The end was quick and absolute. The last coherent British resistance was pockets of men fighting back to back with bayonets, having fired their final rounds. Some were in the camp itself, among the tents. Some had retreated to the base of Isandlwana Hill and climbed the rocks, fighting from higher ground until there was nowhere higher to go. There is a small cave partway up the hill where, according to tradition, The last British soldier died as the sun went dark. Those who survived were almost all mounted, men who had horses and could outride the warriors pursuing them to the Buffalo River. The dismounted soldiers had no chance. Around 60 Europeans made it out. Of the roughly 1,300 men in the camp that morning, over 1,200 were dead by 3 in the afternoon. The pursuit to the Buffalo River was merciless. Zulu warriors ran alongside and behind the fleeing horsemen, killing men whose horses stumbled or whose animals tired. The banks of the river became a secondary battlefield. The water churned with horses, men, and the warriors who pursued them into the shallows. Lieutenants Melville and Coghill tried to save the regimental color, the sacred flag of the 1st Battalion, the 24th, carrying it from the battlefield as the camp collapsed around them. Melville got it to the river, crossed, but was swept from his horse in the current. Coghill went back in to help him. Both were killed on the far bank, their bodies found together with the color case. The flag itself was recovered from the riverbed weeks later, waterlogged and torn. Both officers were awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously, the first posthumous VC awards in British military history. Chelmsford returned to the camp at 5 in the afternoon with his column. He found what his scouts had found ahead of him: fires still burning, tents still standing, the supply intact, and 1,200 bodies in the positions where they had fallen. He spent the night there, sleeping among the dead because there was nowhere else to go. The news reached London on February 11th. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. This was not how things were supposed to happen. The British Empire in 1879 was at the absolute height of its power and confidence, the largest empire in human history, controlling a quarter of the world's land surface, its soldiers armed with the best rifles available, its prestige resting partly on the assumption that British troops simply did not lose battles like this. Not against opponents with spears, not in less than 3 hours, not an entire regiment with all its officers. 52 British officers died at Isandlwana. That was more than had been killed in the 3 main battles of the Waterloo campaign combined. The government's immediate political problem was that the war had been started by Sir Bartle Frere without full cabinet authorization. Frere had been economical with the truth in his reports to London, and the government had not been fully briefed on what he intended. Now they had a disaster on their hands that they had not sanctioned and could not disavow. The response was to send reinforcements, lots of them, and hope that a swift victory would make the question of responsibility easier to deflect. There was at least one piece of news from January 22nd that London could hold up against Isandlwana. That same evening, while Chelmsford was sleeping among his dead, a second Zulu force, 4,000 warriors from the reserves, technically forbidden by Tetshwayo from crossing into British Natal but led by the king's ambitious brother Dabalamanzi, attacked the small mission station at Rorke's Drift across the Buffalo River. 140 British soldiers held the station through a 12-hour night battle, constructing barricades from biscuit boxes and mealie bags, fighting off wave after wave of attacks in the darkness. More than 600 Zulus were killed. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded, the largest number ever given to a single regiment for a single action in British military history. The newspapers made what they could of it. Rorke's Drift became the story Britain told itself about the Zulu War, partly because it was genuinely heroic, and partly because it was a great deal easier to discuss than what had happened 8 miles away that afternoon. Chelmsford moved immediately to place the blame on Durnford, who was conveniently dead and could not defend himself. Durnford, Chelmsford argued, had disobeyed orders by leaving the camp. In fact, no written order told Durnford to stay in the camp. In fact, it had been Chelmsford's decision not to entrench. In fact, the messages warning him of the attack had been reaching him from mid-morning, and he had chosen not to turn back. An official inquiry eventually concluded that the primary cause of the defeat was the underestimate formed of the offensive fighting power of the Zulu army. It did not use Chelmsford's name in connection with this underestimate, but everyone knew whose estimate it had been. The battle changed specific things about how the British Army operated. After Isandlwana, British regiments stopped carrying their regimental colors into combat. The flags that for generations had been the physical representation of a regiment's honor and identity carried into battle since Marlborough. The loss of the 24th's color at Isandlwana had been a particular shock. The practice was quietly discontinued. After Isandlwana, the British never again fought the Zulus in open order linear formation. At every subsequent engagement, they entrenched, formed squares, built lagers. The lesson that a disciplined, mobile enemy could envelop and destroy a spread thin firing line had been written in the bodies of 800 men of the 24th Regiment. Cetshwayo, whose careful defensive strategy had produced the greatest single African victory over a European army in the 19th century, was captured 4 months later after Chelmsford's reinforced army, now finally taking the threat seriously, defeated the main Zulu force at Ulundi. Cetshwayo was exiled first to Cape Town and then, at Queen Victoria's request, transported to London. His gentle manner charmed the city. He met the Queen. She was reportedly impressed. She ordered him restored to his throne, which led to a civil war among factions of his own people, and Cetshwayo died in 1884, possibly poisoned, his kingdom consumed by the internal conflicts his restoration had triggered. Chelmsford was recalled and replaced before the war's final battle, which robbed him of any chance to redeem himself militarily. He returned to England, was never given field command again, and spent the remaining years of his life quietly. On April 9, 1905, 26 years after Isandlwana, he suffered a fatal heart attack while playing billiards at his London club. He was 78 years old. The hill called Isandlwana still stands above the South African plain in KwaZulu-Natal, unchanged in its sphinx-like profile, its slopes whitened with the cairns of stones piled over the dead where they fell. The cairns are not graves in any formal sense. The ground is too rocky to dig, just white stones, hundreds of them, marking the positions where men lay and were eventually buried where the battle left them. There were no winners at Isandlwana. The Zulus suffered somewhere between 1 and 2,000 dead and won nothing that would last. Britain absorbed the shock, sent more troops, and conquered Zululand within 6 months. The kingdom that had won the battle ceased to exist by the end of the year. What Isandlwana left behind was a question that the British Empire spent the following decades quietly grappling with. What did it mean that Chelmsford had been wrong? Not tactically wrong, that was obvious. Strategically, civilizationally wrong. The entire confidence of the Victorian imperial project rested on an assumption that the men with rifles and industry and the world's largest navy were simply better, at every level that mattered, than the men with spears. That the gap in technology was a gap in everything. Isandlwana was a 3-hour proof that it wasn't.